I never imagined that clutching a crinkled piece of paper in a hospital corridor would become the moment that defined my entire life. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed with an almost mocking hum, and my heart thudded in my chest as if trying to remind me that I was still human. For weeks, I'd walked these corridors, guiding his mother's wheelchair, fetching her ice chips, standing by her side when she felt alone, and feeding her spoonfuls of broth whenever her trembling hands failed her. I tried not to think about my husband's absence, telling myself he was away for business, convincing myself over and over again that this was just another demanding project in a distant city that required his personal oversight. But as the hospital's automatic doors swooshed open every time I passed by them, letting in the scent of exhaustion and antiseptic, I felt a gnawing emptiness that refused to be explained away. Even as I led his mother back into her dim, sterile room and fluffed her pillows, I could sense a storm brewing just below the surface of my composure. Something told me that the price I'd pay for my trust would be far greater than the cost scrawled on that hospital invoice. And when the phone call finally came and I heard his voice muffled by laughter, another woman's laughter, so distant and yet so painfully close, I knew the truth. He was not in any boardroom, and he was not making deals for our future. He was on a sunlit beach, living his own version of freedom, while I was stuck in that hospital room, blinking away tears under sickly yellow lights, caring for the mother he'd left behind. But I kept my composure, even as my stomach twisted itself into knots. I told myself I couldn't break down. Not now, not here, not in front of her. She had no one else, and she looked at me sometimes with eyes filled with a strange blend of guilt and gratitude, as though she sensed my heartbreak but felt too frail to intervene. Maybe she even felt complicit, I would think, on the darkest nights as I cried softly in the hard plastic chair beside her bed. She must have known, in some quiet corner of her heart, what her son was capable of, yet she never spoke of it. Instead, she would pat my hand weakly and whisper words of thanks while I spoon-fed her, carefully wiping at the corners of her mouth with a tissue so she wouldn't feel embarrassed. I tried to paint the best possible picture of her son, especially when she asked how he was. Busy, I'd say, forcing my voice to remain gentle, even though it felt like shards of glass were caught in my throat. He's just so busy, you know how he gets with these big projects. But he'll come soon, I'm sure of it. Of course, I knew he wouldn't come soon, not unless he had something to gain from it. But I had accepted that this was my duty. I had promised myself I would be kind, no matter how unkind life felt toward me. I'd always been the type to take pride in my quiet strength, in my ability to remain upright when the world felt determined to knock me down. So I didn't allow myself the luxury of fury, not yet. I kept it buried inside me, tucked away behind a careful smile and a quiet courtesy. I washed her laundry in the hospital's small utility room, spending those long minutes listening to the steady hum of the washing machine as my mind whirled with all the things I wanted to scream at him. How dare you leave me like this, with your mother, with these bills, with these nights of cold, unending fear? But I never let those words pass my lips. I was too busy being the caretaker, the responsible one, the woman who had always done what was expected of her. If I'd learned anything from our marriage, it was how to swallow my needs for the sake of everyone else. It was a lesson hammered into me over years of small betrayals, subtle criticisms, and gentle manipulations that made me doubt my own worth. I was older now, my children nearly grown, and there had been moments in the past when I'd thought about leaving, about finding something better than this half-life, but something always held me back. Fear, habit, love, or some combination of the three. It was a quiet longing for stability that I could never fully abandon. I remember how he used to be when we first married, how he'd grin at me in the early morning light, how he'd promise me the world. He was charming then, or perhaps I was naive enough to see only the charm. In time, I became the support system for all his grand ambitions, the caretaker of his reputation, the mother to his children, and the manager of his home. And as the years wore on, I found myself clinging to scraps of affection and acceptance as though they were precious relics from a bygone era. I convinced myself that this was love, that all marriages eventually slid into comfortable but hollow routines. Yet there I was, in that hospital corridor, alone and abandoned in the most symbolic way possible. The moment I overheard the nurse mention to me that, "Your husband's online too," my heart soared with an irrational hope. Maybe he was back. Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he wanted to talk about how to make his mother's remaining weeks as comfortable as possible. But the moment I pressed the phone to my ear, I heard not just his voice, but the buoyant lilting of another woman in the background, laughing about how the margaritas were too salty. My entire body froze. I could feel the inside of my stomach lurch as if all the illusions I'd been harboring broke open at once. His voice, low and vaguely irritated that I even answered, told me that he was calling to check in. He said that with a lazy drawl, like a bored king making a perfunctory nod to his subjects. He asked how his mother was doing, said he felt awful he couldn't be there, but work was so demanding. I couldn't speak. Not even a word. For a moment, the entire corridor seemed to spin, and I actually had to lean against the wall for support. The phone trembled in my hand, but I managed somehow to form a sentence. "She's stable," I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears, as though I were listening to someone else speak through a static line. "You know these hospital bills are piling up, right?" He clicked his tongue impatiently and said not to worry, that he'd handle it. Then he hung up with a small sigh, as though this entire conversation was a chore he'd had to endure before returning to his perfect little oasis. I remained standing there, the beeping of distant machines mingling with the chatter of passing nurses, staring at the phone as though it might hold all the answers I'd been too afraid to confront. And it was only after I placed the phone back in its cradle that I realized tears were streaming down my face. The nurse pretended not to notice, but her sympathetic look told me she'd guessed more than I wanted her to. I thanked her quietly, then turned on my heel, heading back to his mother's room, determined not to let her see the heartbreak that was surely etched into my features. She was dozing lightly, and I was grateful for that. It gave me time to compose myself, time to rearrange my face into that calm expression she found reassuring. And as I watched her breathing, I thought about the countless sacrifices I'd made for him, for this family, for a man who'd abandoned me in every sense that mattered. Slowly, I slid into the chair next to her bed and stroked her hand, the soft beep of her heart monitor lulling me into a bitter reverie. The ring on my finger glinted under the fluorescent lights, a silent reminder of the vows I'd once believed in. I wondered if he'd even bothered to remove his ring while he was out there with his mistress. I wondered if she cared that he was a married man, or if that was part of the allure. If I could have screamed in that moment, I might have shattered the windows with the force of my betrayal. But instead, I just sighed, closed my eyes, and pushed the tears away. Over the next few days, I began to piece together the truth. The business trip had been a lie, of course, and the woman he was with was someone new, not even the same mistress I'd suspected months ago. A neighbor's gossip with a nurse, a stray mention of, "Oh, he's in Cancun," the photos posted online by some mutual acquaintance who casually mentioned spotting him looking quite cozy with a younger woman. All these little morsels fell into my lap, forming a mosaic of lies that I could no longer ignore. And each new revelation stabbed at me, leaving me feeling raw and foolish, yet I remained silent. I had no one to turn to, no one I trusted with the full weight of my despair. My children were grown, busy with their own lives, and I knew they would feel compelled to take sides. I didn't want to drag them into this twisted drama. For years, I'd kept the worst of his behavior hidden from them, preserving his image because I thought that was what a good wife and mother did, because I felt that admitting the truth about him would unravel the facade of our family. Still, I felt resentful that I was always the one sacrificing, always the one smoothing over the cracks, always the one who swallowed her pride for the sake of peace. Somewhere along the way, I had lost the sense of who I was outside of him. I had forgotten my own worth. And maybe, in a twisted sense, that hospital bill was the wake-up call I needed. It was hefty, of course, and I worried about how we'd manage to cover it while he was gallivanting around on tropical vacations, but it also represented something else. It represented all the burdens I'd been carrying alone, all the responsibilities he had shirked with hardly a backward glance. I found myself glaring at the bold-faced sum printed on that invoice and thinking, this should be his burden, or at least ours, together. Why should I bear it alone? Why should I keep pretending that everything is fine when it's far from it? And in that little flicker of anger, I felt something new, a sense of possibility, a glimmer of an idea that maybe I didn't have to continue playing this role forever. Maybe there was a way to turn this situation on its head. Maybe the humiliations and the exhaustion and the heartbreak could be channeled into something else, something that would remind him that I wasn't just a doormat to be stepped on. The idea crept into my mind late one night as I sat by his mother's bedside, listening to her soft snores and the rhythmic beep of the monitors. I don't know what triggered it exactly. Perhaps it was the memory of her once telling me, he's my son, but sometimes I worry about his heart. He can be so selfish. Or maybe it was simply the buildup of so many injustices, so many tiny cruelties that I'd endured over the years. Whatever it was, my mind latched onto that hospital bill. And I suddenly recalled his mistress's name, not just her name, but the times she had brazenly texted him while he was still living under our roof, not even bothering to hide the sweet nothings she sent. She thought she was winning, I realized. She thought she had snatched him away from me. But did she also realize what came with that victory? Did she know the cost of being with a man like him? The actual, literal cost? A small, bitter smile curved my lips, and I felt the first stirrings of a plan. It felt vindictive, yes, but also strangely liberating. For so long, I'd let anger simmer inside me without any outlet. But the thought of sending her that hospital bill, of letting her see just how much it cost to be part of his life, was intoxicating in its own small way. I told myself I would wait, that I would finalize everything properly, that I would handle the details with the same care and attention I'd given to everything else in my life. But the seed was planted, and from that moment on, I found myself moving through the days with a renewed sense of purpose. I took careful note of the address I'd once spotted on an envelope from her, the one I'd nearly thrown away without looking. I made phone calls to confirm the final cost, double-checking every line item, and all the while I continued caring for his mother, refusing to let her sense the resentment that churned within me. The nurses complimented me on my devotion, and sometimes even his mother's eyes would fill with tears when she thanked me for being there. I know it's not easy, she whispered one morning after a particularly difficult night. You've always done so much for this family, and I'm sorry you don't have more support. I swallowed hard, tears burning the back of my throat. For a moment, I thought about telling her everything, that her beloved son was not who she believed him to be, that he had left me to shoulder this alone while he vacationed with a woman who had no place in our lives. But I couldn't bring myself to shatter her illusions. In her own way, she was suffering enough. So I simply patted her hand and said, I made a promise and I won't break it. Don't worry about me. The days stretched on, blurring into nights, and I found myself existing in a strange limbo, waiting for his inevitable return, dreading and anticipating it in equal measure. Part of me longed to see his face, to confront him, to unleash the fury that had been building behind my eyes. Another part of me dreaded the confrontation, feared that I would crumble the moment I saw him, that I would revert to the submissive caretaker role, the one he always expected me to play. But then the hospital made its final push. His mother was going to be discharged soon, though she would need ongoing care at home. The day I learned this, I stepped outside into the crisp autumn air, letting the cool breeze hit my face. It felt like a slap and a caress all at once. I realized I had a choice to make. Either continue this charade of a marriage or acknowledge that something in me had fundamentally changed. I walked to the nearest bench, sank down onto it, and stared at the trees shedding their leaves in a swirl of color. My mind drifted back to a time when we'd first moved into our house, when I'd been so eager to please him, to create a warm and inviting home. I remembered how he'd praised my efforts in front of his friends, saying how lucky he was to have a wife who took such pride in her surroundings. And I remembered how, not long after, those same friends teased him, calling him whipped, and he laughed along, gradually diminishing my contributions in the public eye as if he couldn't afford to be seen praising me too much. In that moment, staring at the fallen leaves, the sense of betrayal I felt was tinged with the realization I had been complicit in diminishing myself for years, all for a false sense of security. The notion of sending the mistress the hospital bill suddenly felt like a key that might unlock a door. A door to what exactly? I wasn't entirely sure. But it felt like a door away from passivity, away from the role of silent victim. Perhaps it was petty, perhaps it was vindictive, but it also felt necessary. So I took the hospital invoice, slid it into a plain white envelope, and wrote her name and address on it with careful precision. I sealed it with trembling fingers, feeling as though I was sealing away a part of my life I could never get back. But there was a strange satisfaction in it, a sense of planting a flag that declared, I see you, and you will see me. No more hiding, no more ignorance. You want him? Then you can share in the burdens he leaves behind. At first, I planned to mail it anonymously, but then I thought better of it. I included a brief note. Since you enjoyed his time, I trust you'll have no issue sharing the cost of his mother's care. Welcome to the family obligations. Sincerely. I didn't sign my name. The next morning, with my pulse racing, I dropped the envelope into a mailbox before heading to the hospital. The act itself was simple, slipping a piece of paper through a metal slot. Yet I felt as though I'd stepped onto a battlefield, having just fired a warning shot. For the rest of the day, I hovered around his mother's hospital room with a heightened sense of awareness, as if expecting a call or a message at any moment, but nothing came. I silently berated myself for expecting immediate gratification, reminding myself that mail took time, that I might not see any reaction for days, and so I carried on, maintaining the guise of normalcy, but inside, I felt the tension coil tighter with each passing hour. As expected, my husband finally returned from his trip. He showed up at the hospital one afternoon, looking tanned and annoyed. I was assisting his mother with her soup, my back turned to the door. But I felt him enter before I saw him. The air in the room seemed to shift, a subtle current of agitation rippling through my spine. I glanced over my shoulder and offered him a stiff nod, forcing my lips into a semblance of a smile for his mother's sake. She brightened at the sight of him, her frail hands reaching out as she asked how he'd been. He came over to her bedside, kissed her cheek, and mumbled something about busy times at work, not meeting my eyes. I didn't say a word. It was the first time in our long marriage that I felt no urge to greet him, to smooth over the awkwardness. Instead, I turned back to feeding his mother, the plastic spoon trembling slightly in my hand. He didn't notice, of course. He was too busy talking about what needed to be done for her discharge, how he had arranged for a nurse to come by the house, how he was so sorry he hadn't been here, but pressing matters had come up. I listened in silence, my anger simmering just below the surface. It wasn't until we were alone, after his mother dozed off, that he spoke to me directly. Even then, he didn't look at me. He looked around the room, as though searching for something to criticize. I hear the bills have been sent, he said, his voice tight. You could have waited until I got back, you know. My heart pounded, but I kept my composure. I didn't realize you were taking care of them, I said quietly. You seemed occupied. He shot me a glare, his nostrils flaring. Well, I am back now. You don't need to act like you run this show alone. I swallowed a bitter retort. For a moment, I wondered if he'd already caught wind of what I'd done. But he gave no indication that he knew about the envelope I'd mailed. He didn't mention the mistress, didn't acknowledge his trip as anything but business. Perhaps he believed he could pretend forever. We left it at that, a stale tension lingering between us. Over the following days, he tried to assert more control, talking to doctors, billing departments, and scheduling nurses. He never once apologized for his absence or gave me any explanation for why he'd truly been gone. Instead, he seemed to approach the situation as a project to be managed, as though that could erase the fact that I'd spent sleepless nights in this building, holding his mother's trembling hand. I almost laughed at the contrast. He insisted on being the figure in charge, yet he'd done absolutely nothing when it truly mattered. And now, though I didn't say it aloud, I found solace in the knowledge that my letter was out there somewhere, making its way to her. Days went by without any sign of reaction. I resumed my routine, helping his mother recover, driving her home, setting up the living room so she could rest on a comfortable recliner, ensuring she had everything she needed. My husband, for his part, pretended we were a team again, pointing out the changes he wanted done around the house to accommodate his mother's condition. I complied stoically, ignoring his requests to talk privately, to work things out. I knew I was walking on a tightrope, that eventually we'd have to face what had happened, but I also knew that once we did, there would be no going back. The anger in me was building. I felt it in my bones, in the taut muscles of my neck, in the sleepless nights where I stared at the ceiling and pictured him holding her in his arms on that beach, laughing at my gullibility. The hospital bill, ironically, had become a symbol of my resentment, a testament to all that I'd endured while he indulged in his own selfish desires. It took nearly a week for the response to arrive. It came in the form of a shrill phone call. I was in the kitchen preparing soup for his mother when my cell phone rang with an unknown number. My husband was out getting groceries, a chore I suspected he did more to appear dutiful than out of any genuine desire to help. I answered, my heart pounding. A furious female voice erupted on the other end. "Who the hell do you think you are?" She didn't even bother with a greeting. I didn't need to guess who it was. I recognized her voice from the few times she'd called our house, asking for my husband in that artificially sweet tone. My heart thudded in my chest, but a strange calm came over me as well. "I'm the woman caring for his mother," I replied quietly. "I assume you got the envelope." She spat out words laced with venom, calling me insane, childish, vindictive. She hurled accusations that I was trying to trap him financially, that I was clinging to a marriage that was over, that I was jealous of her youth and beauty. For a moment, her words stung, and I had to grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. But as she went on, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch, something in me hardened. I let her rant, occasionally offering a simple, "Are you finished?" or "I see," until she finally paused for breath. Then I said, in a voice I barely recognized as my own, "He belongs to you now, doesn't he? So does everything that comes with him. Bills, responsibilities, guilt, betrayal. Congratulations," she sputtered, seemingly taken aback by the coldness in my tone. Then she launched into another tirade, threatening to take legal action to inform him of what I'd done to ruin me financially. I listened, the calm in me growing stronger. It was as though I could finally see the power dynamic shifting, as though sending that envelope had caused a fracture in her fantasy. "Do what you must," I said. "I won't stop you. But let me ask you this. Has he ever told you the truth about anything? Or do you just accept whatever lie he feeds you, the way I used to?" Her silence was palpable. I heard her breathing heavily into the phone, and for an instant I felt a pang of pity for her. She had no idea what kind of man she'd entangled herself with, no idea that her illusions were built on a foundation of quicksand. But that pity quickly dissolved into something else, a firm resolve that I would no longer be the victim here. She cursed me one last time before hanging up, and I stood there, phone still in hand, staring at the quiet kitchen. My cheeks burned, but my eyes were dry. I took a trembling breath and set the phone down. In the silence that followed, I felt a ripple of triumph, tinged with a deep sadness at what my life had come to. It wasn't how I'd imagined breaking free from this man, from this cycle of emotional neglect and manipulation, but it was a start. When my husband returned home, I could tell something was wrong immediately. He set the groceries down on the counter with a thud, refusing to meet my eyes. His mother was in the next room, dozing in front of the television. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded in a low voice, stepping closer to me. I maintained my composure, refusing to be intimidated by his stance or his seething tone. "I have no idea what you mean," I said, my voice calm. Oh, don't play dumb, he snapped. She called me. She's furious. Said you sent her a bill. Accused her of. He paused, raking a hand through his hair. What did you think you'd gain from this? Are you trying to humiliate me? Bankrupt me? I felt a small surge of power in my chest, seeing him so rattled, so off balance. It's your mother's medical bill, I said quietly. We're married, so her expenses are technically ours, but if you've moved on with her, why should I shoulder it alone? Hmm? He opened his mouth, then closed it, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. He hadn't expected this version of me, the version that wouldn't back down, that wouldn't beg or cry. You think this is funny? He asked, his voice shaking with anger. You think this will fix anything? I shook my head slowly. It was never about fixing anything. It was about showing you and your mistress that actions have consequences. You want to live a life free of obligations while I stay here and deal with everything you left behind? Fine. But don't expect me to keep your secrets or your bills in the dark. He looked at me with an intensity I'd never seen before, like he was seeing me for the first time. For a second, I wondered if he might lash out physically, but he simply glared at me with raw hatred in his eyes. Then he stormed out, slamming the door so violently that the windows rattled. His mother stirred in the living room, calling my name in confusion. I hurried to her side, forcing a reassuring smile. It's okay, I told her softly. He just has some business to attend to. She frowned, looking worried, but I gently stroked her hair and told her everything would be fine. A lie, perhaps, but I had a new resolve. I would care for her because she deserved dignity in her final years, not because it was expected of me as his wife. A strange sense of peace settled over me that night as I sat alone in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the flickering TV across from the recliner where she slept. I realized I felt no guilt for sending that bill. No shame. If anything, I felt liberated. It was a small act, but it represented a greater shift. I was no longer content to be the silent, suffering martyr of this story. I was claiming a piece of power back, even if it was messy, even if it led to conflict. Over the following days, my husband oscillated between explosive anger and dismissive silence. He slept in the guest room, or sometimes didn't come home at all. When he did speak to me, it was often in hushed, urgent tones, warning me not to drag our children into this, cautioning me against going too far. It was almost laughable. He'd had no problem going too far himself, sneaking off with another woman, breaking every vow he ever made. But now he was worried about maintaining appearances. This time, however, I felt no desire to protect his image. Something in me had broken free, a voice that refused to be silenced. When he told me he was leaving for a few days to clear his head, I merely shrugged. Do whatever you need to, I said. I sensed he wanted me to fight him on it, to beg him to stay, to somehow give him the moral high ground. But I didn't. I let him walk out that door, watched him throw his suitcase in the back of his car, and I felt relief. I'd spent so much of my life in the shadow of his needs and desires that the moment he left, the house felt bigger, lighter. I slept that night better than I had in weeks. In the morning, his mother asked where he was, and I told her gently that he had some business to take care of. She gazed at me with tired eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken questions, but she didn't press. Perhaps she sensed the tension, or perhaps she was simply too tired to inquire further. Either way, I resumed my role of caretaker, not because I owed it to him, but because I believed she deserved kindness. And through the days that followed, I discovered a newfound sense of confidence. I stopped tiptoeing around my own home. I called a lawyer. A quiet conversation that left me trembling yet determined. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I wanted to know my options. She was sympathetic, outlining potential courses of action for me, including protecting my assets, ensuring that if I chose to leave, I wouldn't be left penniless. It was a sobering conversation, one that crystallized the reality of how precarious my situation was. But it also galvanized me. I spent long nights on the phone with a therapist friend of mine who lived out of state. She urged me to stand up for myself, to remember that I had value beyond what he had told me. For the first time in decades, I felt like I was making decisions for myself instead of reacting to his demands. And in the quiet spaces between caring for his mother and planning my future, I found moments of reflection. I looked at old photos and realized how small and worn out I appeared in them, how often I had plastered on a smile to hide my sadness. I remembered the little comments he used to make, criticizing my cooking when it wasn't as good as his mother's, insulting my taste in music, questioning why I'd cut my hair. Each memory washed over me like a cold wave, and I realized how deeply ingrained his control had been. The phone rang again about a week later. This time it was my husband. He sounded calmer, but there was a distinct edge to his voice. He demanded to know when we could talk in person. I told him I wasn't sure, that I was busy caring for his mother and also exploring my legal rights. He scoffed at that, accusing me of trying to destroy our family. I laughed without humor. Our family was destroyed the day you chose to run off with her, I said, my voice steady. All I did was finally respond. Uh, he fell silent for a long moment, and I almost thought he'd hung up. But then he spoke, his voice quieter, almost pleading. Look, can we just figure this out? My mother's well-being is at stake. Do we really need to drag everyone else into this? You know how complicated it gets with lawyers. His tone was so typical of him, manipulative, trying to appeal to my sense of guilt, my fear of conflict. But I'd had enough. I'll be here when you're ready to talk in person, I said simply. Until then, I have nothing else to say. I hung up, my hand trembling slightly. I realized then that a conversation was coming, a confrontation that could reshape the rest of my life. But I also realized I was ready for it. I was tired of living in half-truths and illusions. I wanted the cold, hard truth out in the open, no matter how painful it might be. Over the next few days, I busied myself with tasks around the house and with his mother's care. She was improving slowly, and I could see gratitude in her eyes whenever she looked at me. Sometimes she would attempt to get up on her own, and I'd gently remind her to call for me or the nurse instead, not wanting her to strain herself. Her vulnerability touched me deeply. She had once been a strong woman, raising a son on her own after her husband's early death. Perhaps that was part of the reason she clung to the belief that her son couldn't truly be this cruel. I cared for her partly out of duty, partly out of empathy, and partly because, despite everything, I felt she and I were in this together, both victims of the same man's selfishness. Finally, the day arrived when he walked through the front door again, a tense resolve in his posture. I had just helped his mother to her recliner, making sure she had water and her remote control nearby. When I saw him step inside, I calmly asked the nurse to give us some privacy. She nodded sympathetically, leaving the room with quiet efficiency. He and I stood there in the living room, the silence between us, thick as a storm cloud. His eyes flicked to his mother, who was gazing at the two of us with weary confusion. With a forced smile, he told her he needed to speak with me in private, then motioned for me to follow him into the kitchen. My heart pounded as I closed the kitchen door behind me, bracing myself for whatever was to come. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, looking at me like I was some kind of adversary he needed to outsmart. "She's losing it," he said bluntly, nodding toward the door. "She's asking me if we're okay. Do you really want to stress her out?" I bit back a retort. "I'm not the one who left her in the hospital while I ran off with another woman." His jaw tightened. "That's none of your business. Our issues, my issues with you, those are separate from my mother's care. You've always been too emotional about everything. For God's sake, I needed a break." "A break?" I echoed, my voice trembling with anger. "From your mother's hospitalization? From our marriage? From reality?" He rolled his eyes. "Stop being so dramatic. Look, I'm willing to work something out. We can discuss finances, arrange some separation of duties, but sending her the hospital bill was a low blow, even for you. I let out a bitter laugh. Low blow? You think I haven't endured low blows for years? Everything I've done, every sacrifice I've made, every humiliating moment I've swallowed in silence. You never once cared. Now, suddenly you want to talk about moral high ground because I inconvenienced your mistress? His face reddened. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. Don't call her that. I arched an eyebrow. What would you prefer I call her? He sighed, exasperated. I didn't come here to fight about this. I came here to talk about how we move forward. I stared at him, my heart hammering. There is no moving forward, I said quietly. Not as husband and wife, not anymore. His eyes flickered with something that might have been fear or regret, but it was gone in an instant. So that's it? You're just going to give up over a stupid fling? The casual dismissal of what he'd done sent a wave of fury through me. It wasn't just a fling, it was a betrayal of my trust, of your mother's trust, of our vows. And even if it was a fling, it's not the first time, is it? He started to protest, but the look in my eyes must have stopped him. He knew I knew about the others, maybe not all the details, but enough to piece it together. Fine, he said harshly. You want a divorce? Go ahead. But don't expect me to roll over and let you take everything. For a moment, I felt a surge of panic. The financial uncertainty, the legal hurdles, it was also daunting. But I forced myself to remember the quiet strength that had kept me afloat all these years. I'd navigated the complexities of his mother's care alone. I'd weathered emotional storms that he'd never bothered to notice. I could handle this too. I'm not asking for everything, I said, my voice calm. I just want what's fair. And I want my dignity back. He looked away, his shoulders slumping slightly. For a brief instant, I saw a flicker of the man I'd once loved, hidden behind the layers of arrogance and anger. But then his face hardened again. Don't make this any uglier than it needs to be. We still have a family. We have kids, for God's sake. Yes, I said softly. We do. And I've protected them from the worst of you for a long time. But I won't keep lying to them. They're adults now. They deserve the truth. Ugh. He raked a hand through his hair. You're impossible. There was a long silence. In that stillness, I heard the faint sound of his mother's television in the next room, a reminder that life was still ticking by, that she was out there, depending on me. Finally, he exhaled, the anger seeping out of him. We'll figure out the financials, he said in a resigned tone, but just keep my mother out of this. Let's not make her worry. I nodded, feeling a heaviness in my chest. I won't do anything to hurt her, I said. I never have. He gave me a look I couldn't quite decipher, something between contempt and reluctant respect, before turning to leave. Just before he walked out of the kitchen, he glanced back at me. That was a dirty trick, you know, sending her the hospital bill. I never thought you had it in you. I looked him straight in the eye. You never bothered to look closely, did you? And then he left, leaving me alone in the kitchen, the echoes of our conversation rattling around in my head. I leaned against the counter, trying to steady my breathing. I realized that despite the tension and the hurt, I felt strangely empowered. I had stood my ground. For once, I hadn't let him bully me into submission, and the simple act of mailing that bill, while small in the grand scheme of things, had been the catalyst for this entire upheaval. It was the first ripple in a long, stagnant pond, the first crack in a wall that had stood between me and my own sense of self-worth. Over the next few days, the house fell into an uneasy calm. He didn't return, and I didn't ask him to. Instead, I focused on his mother, on ensuring she got stronger. The nurse came and went, offering me kind words and gentle encouragement. She must have sensed the tension too, but she didn't pry. Our children called occasionally, but I kept details vague, not wanting to alarm them just yet. I did, however, take steps to protect myself. I started gathering important documents, bank statements, anything that would help me navigate the financial mess that was sure to come. And through it all, I felt a determination I hadn't experienced in years. It was as though I'd been sleepwalking for so long, and now I was finally awake, finally aware of my own power. The phone rang one afternoon, and I tensed, worried it might be him or her again. Instead, it was my lawyer informing me that she'd sent over some preliminary paperwork for me to review. My hands trembled as I thanked her. This was really happening. I was on the verge of a new life, one that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Late that night, after I'd helped his mother to bed, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, a dim lamp casting soft light across the floor. I stared at a photograph on the mantel, an old family photo from a happier time. In it, he and I stood side by side, our children in front of us, all of us smiling. I reached out and touched the frame lightly. I remembered the day that photo was taken, how I'd felt a brief moment of pure happiness, believing that we could be the perfect family. Had it all been a lie? Or had it been real, once, before life and resentment and infidelity had chipped away at the foundations? As I sat there, I thought about the woman I'd been back then, hopeful, trusting, unaware of the heartbreak that awaited me. A lump formed in my throat as I silently said goodbye to her. She deserved better, I thought, and now, perhaps, she was finally going to get it. In the days that followed, I received more calls from the mistress, each one more frantic than the last. She threatened me, pleaded with me, demanded to know what I wanted. She seemed incapable of understanding that I wasn't trying to extract money from her or from him, though I did quietly note that they'd both arranged to pay the hospital bill. Perhaps that was their way of tying up a loose end. Each time she called, I said little, letting her words wash over me. I had already won the battle that mattered to me, standing up for myself. Her desperation only served to highlight how unsettled their relationship had become. The illusions she'd had of a carefree romance had been shattered by the undeniable reality of an ailing mother-in-law, medical bills, and the knowledge that her lover was not just a charming man, but a betrayer of vows. And with each call, I felt a small sense of satisfaction, though I tried not to let it consume me. Meanwhile, I arranged a family meeting with my children. It was a difficult conversation, explaining that their father and I were separating, that I had reached a breaking point after discovering his ongoing infidelity. They were adults now, so I didn't sugarcoat it, though I refrained from giving them the most painful details. Their reactions ranged from shock to quiet understanding. One of them admitted they'd suspected something was off for a while, but hadn't wanted to stir the pot. I felt a pang of guilt, wondering how many signs they'd picked up on, how many times they'd seen me quietly suffering and said nothing. But mostly I felt relief that I could finally be honest. They offered me support, each in their own way, and I realized that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. The day after that meeting, I walked outside to the backyard, gazing at the autumn leaves scattered across the lawn. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of impending winter. I breathed in deeply, feeling a mixture of sorrow and anticipation. My life was about to change drastically. Divorce, legal battles, the splitting of assets. These were all looming on the horizon. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that for the first time in years, I was truly living, not just existing in someone else's shadow. As I stood there, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw my husband approaching. He looked older somehow, like the weight of recent events had finally started to show in the lines of his face. He stopped a few feet away from me. We stared at each other for a long moment, the silence heavy with unspoken words. "I heard you talk to the kids," he said quietly. I nodded. Yes, they deserve to know. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not going to fight you on the divorce," he said, "but I do want to make one thing clear. I never meant for it to get this far. I never wanted to hurt you." The old me might have softened at those words. might have found a spark of hope. But now I saw them for what they were. Too little, too late. Whether you meant it or not, you did, I replied, my voice steady, and I refuse to keep living like this. He nodded, looking down at the ground. What about my mother? She wants to stay here. I felt a stab of sadness. I'd grown fond of her, despite everything. She can stay as long as she needs, I said. I have no intention of kicking her out. But we'll have to figure out logistics if we move forward with the divorce. He looked up at me, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, he said softly, for everything you've done for her. I know I haven't. No, I interrupted. You haven't. And that's between you and her. But I'll do what I can to ensure she's cared for. He nodded again, his gaze lingering on me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he turned and walked back inside, leaving me alone in the yard. I closed my eyes and took another deep breath, letting the autumn air fill my lungs. I thought about the envelope I'd mailed, the significance it held. It was a small act, really, but it had shattered the complacency that bound me. It had forced me to confront the truth of my life, to acknowledge my anger and heartbreak, and finally, to demand something better for myself. It occurred to me that sometimes the most meaningful changes begin with a single, seemingly insignificant action. In the grand scope of things, sending someone a hospital bill might not appear monumental. But for me, it was the spark that set the entire chain of events in motion. It was my silent declaration that I would no longer be complicit in my own exploitation, that I would no longer hide from the reality of my situation. In the weeks that followed, my life became a whirlwind of legal consultations, family discussions, and raw, emotional confrontations. I discovered reserves of strength I hadn't known I possessed. I faced my husband's accusations and half-hearted apologies with a calm determination, no longer afraid to speak my truth. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, mourning the years I'd lost, the illusions I'd held dear, the warmth I'd once believed in. But each morning, I woke up knowing I was inching closer to freedom. Meanwhile, his mistress continued to loom in the background, calling or texting him, sometimes calling or texting me, demanding explanations, threatening to leave him if he didn't make up his mind. I found it all rather ironic. She had assumed she was simply stepping into an easy romance, but she'd stumbled into a tangled web of family obligations, unresolved resentments, and financial responsibility. In a way, I almost pitied her. But, pity or not, I felt no remorse for shattering her illusions. She had knowingly pursued a married man, and if she had thought it was all cocktails on the beach and zero accountability, well, the hospital bill told a different story. My children, sensing the gravity of the situation, rallied around me. One of them even suggested I come live with them, at least temporarily, but I declined, determined to stand on my own 2 feet for once. I did, however, start taking steps to build a new life, considering job opportunities, looking into smaller living arrangements that could accommodate my mother-in-law if necessary, speaking with a lawyer about ways to ensure I wouldn't be left destitute. Each step felt monumental, each decision a turning point. I was no longer drifting, I was navigating, and it was terrifying, exhilarating, heartbreaking, and freeing all at once. The final confrontation with him came on a cold evening near the end of the year. He'd been in and out of the house, avoiding me, avoiding the reality of what was happening. But I cornered him in the living room while his mother was asleep. I told him I wanted to finalize the divorce arrangements, that I was done dragging this out. He resisted at first, saying he needed more time to think, but I stood my ground. We both know where this is headed, I said, looking him square in the eye. Delaying it only creates more misery. His anger flared again, and he accused me of acting out of spite, of never really loving him. I let him rant, his voice rising. But when he finally paused, I met his gaze evenly. I loved you for years, I said softly. I sacrificed for you, built a life around you. You stepped out on our marriage, not once, but multiple times. And worst of all, you left me alone in that hospital when I needed you most. Don't talk to me about love. He stared at me, his face contorted in a mix of rage and something else, perhaps regret. Then he turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, muttering curses under his breath. I didn't go after him. I'd done that too many times before. Instead, I retreated to the bedroom I now occupied alone, closed the door, and sank onto the bed, tears streaming down my face. But these tears were different from the ones I'd shed in the hospital corridor. They were tears of release, tears of finality. I let them flow, cradling my own sense of heartbreak and relief. Days turned into weeks, and the legal process inched forward. Discussions with the lawyer continued, paperwork was filed. My husband became increasingly scarce, spending more time at her place than at ours. But I continued to care for his mother, who was now well enough to move around the house with minimal assistance. She noticed his absence, of course, but never pressed me for details. Perhaps she sensed that he wasn't the man she'd hoped he was. Perhaps she felt too frail to address the truth head on. Instead, she showed me quiet gratitude every day, thanking me for small kindnesses, making her favorite meal, helping her bathe, keeping her company in the evenings. In her own gentle way, she'd become an unexpected ally. One snowy morning, we sat together in the living room, watching the flakes drift past the window. She reached over and took my hand, her voice soft. "I'm sorry," she said, "for everything." Her words caught me off guard and tears pricked my eyes. "It's not your fault," I whispered. She squeezed my hand weakly. "Maybe not, but I'm still sorry." And in that moment, a wave of compassion washed over me. We were two women bound by the same man's flaws, yet we both remained determined to find our dignity. Through the next few weeks, we settled into a kind of routine. I'd cook, we'd watch TV, she'd ask after her son in a vague, gentle way, and I'd reassure her without giving specifics. Meanwhile, the divorce moved forward. My husband signed papers begrudgingly. There were moments of bitter back and forth, arguments about assets, about money, about blame. But the decision was made. We both knew there was no salvaging this. When I finally had to move out, agreeing to let him keep the house for his mother's sake in exchange for a fair settlement, I packed my things with a sense of numbness and quiet hope. My children helped me load boxes into a van, their comforting presence reminding me that I was not alone, that I still had family who loved me. I left behind the place where I'd built so many memories, both joyful and painful, but I carried with me the knowledge that I was stepping into a new chapter of my life, one that I would write on my own terms. The day I handed over the keys felt momentous. I stood on the front porch for a moment, gazing at the empty living room through the window, remembering how many hours I'd spent there, waiting for him, worrying about him, loving him. A part of me felt sorrow at what was lost, but a stronger part felt relief at finally having the chance to be free. I think about the envelope sometimes, about the moment I dropped it into the mailbox. It was a small act, but it was the catalyst that set off a chain reaction, forcing me to confront truths I'd long ignored. It's strange to think that something as mundane as a hospital bill could carry so much weight, could serve as a turning point for an entire life. But it did. And for that, I'm grateful. In my new place, a modest apartment overlooking a small park, I often reflect on how my life has changed. I miss the familiarity of routine, the comfort of having someone else share my bed. But I do not miss the lies, the betrayals, the constant feeling of being second to someone or something else. Slowly, I'm learning who I am without him, and I'm finding that I can stand on my own just fine. I don't know exactly what the future holds. God, I don't know if I'll find love again or if I'll continue down this path alone. But I do know that I no longer live in fear of his judgment or in the shadow of his desires. I'm forging my own path, one day at a time, with every messy, beautiful, painful choice. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I'll light a candle by my window and let the flickering light guide me into a soft reverie. I'll think back to those hospital corridors, the antiseptic smell, the whir of machines, the lonely nights. I'll remember the moment I realized how alone I was in that marriage, how deeply he'd wounded me. And then I'll remember the subsequent moment of clarity, the act of sealing that envelope, the sweet sense of triumph in mailing it, and the aftermath that led me here. I'll sit with those memories, allowing the pain and the pride to mingle in my chest. And I'll remind myself that I am not defined by his betrayal, nor by the years I spent trying to hold a broken marriage together. I am defined by the choices I make now, by the courage I found to stand up for myself and reclaim my life when it felt like all hope was lost. If I've learned anything from this journey, it's that we should never underestimate the power of a single moment, a single decision, a single act of reclaiming our worth. For me, it was sending that hospital bill. For someone else, it might be making a phone call, leaving a letter on a pillow, or walking out the door one final time. These choices, small as they may appear in the grand scheme, can be the spark that illuminates a path forward, a path away from deception and despair. And for that, I will be forever grateful to myself, to the quiet strength I found, to the simple yet profound act of drawing a line in the sand and saying, enough. I am done. I deserve better. Now, when I wake up in the morning, the sun shining through my curtains, I feel a flicker of possibility in my chest. The day stretches before me like a blank page, full of questions and challenges, but also brimming with a sense of freedom I haven't felt in years. And in that freedom, I find the seeds of something I'd almost lost entirely. Mhm. Hope.